Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Well, this week, This Jungian Life thought that we would do what everyone else in the world is doing and discuss our coronavirus. And we want to frame it archetypally. We're going to talk about the archetype of the plague. We're hoping to really get up underneath this topic to look at the mythic dimensions. So hopefully we're bringing you something a little bit different than you may be reading or hearing elsewhere.
Wow, this is really pretty big to think about the archetype of the plague. And I am thinking about all the mythic kinds of catastrophes, plagues, pestilences, etc., that we know about from sources like the Bible. The plague was one of the things that Yahweh sent to Egypt. He sent 10 plagues, from frogs and locusts to affecting livestock, darkness for 3 days, turning water to blood. And then the very last one, which bears the most sort of parallel similarity to our COVID, was that he was going to send the death of the firstborn, and the Israelites smeared their doors with lamb's blood so that the plague would pass them by. And people are dying from this virus, and I think there couldn't be anything scarier than suddenly losing loved ones.
So it's a kind of divine punishment.
Yes, that's exactly the implication, is whether there has been a divine intervention in the affairs of man. For not in the case of the Israelites, he was trying to persuade or force the Egyptians to let the Israelites go. But the implication is that because the Egyptians were not worshiping Yahweh, that they were not obeying divine law. And I wonder if there's a parallel implication for us.
It may very well be, but one of the things that's always compelled me about the story of the plague, Deb, is that God hardens the heart of Pharaoh.
Yes.
So that he refuses to be moved by the plague. So there's this very complicated, wider circle of a larger intelligence, some transcendental pattern that is constellating in that story that creates this dance of resistance and suffering and liberation and enslavement. And they're all held in the hand of this archetype. And I think we're seeing those dynamics right now in the culture. How, for instance, as the illness is rising, some leaders are hardening their hearts and refusing to respond, refusing to let resources go. Refusing to let federal workers go home, for that matter, but hardening the ego defenses as a kind of reaction. And it's not until a quantity of suffering manifests that the hardness then is broken down.
Yeah, that's very much, I think, applicable to what's going on as we record today in the UK, where the government there is not taking a lot of action to close down large events, for example, and pursuing a tack that a lot of people think is very foolish and are very concerned about.
It's such a good parallel that you've lifted up, Joseph, of ego and unconscious, as we would talk about it at an individual level. But the parallel is to the macro or collective level of where is the resistance of business as usual and kind of perhaps underreacting that things are going to stay the way they are now, the way they, quote, should be, unquote. Whether that will spawn terrible consequences as it did for the Egyptians, because there is an underlying, much larger reality here called Mother Nature, which corresponds to the collective unconscious, the deep unconscious, and that ego does not mandate rules for Mother Nature.
So, staying with this image from the Old Testament and the plagues, I don't have an answer for this next question, but I'd love to mull it over. If we were to take that paradigm as if it's a collective dream, so the Pharaoh's heart is hardened, the Israelites are enslaved, his heart must be broken, and it is finally the death of his firstborn son that seems to break the Pharaoh's heart open, which has been held closed by God. So, what is enslaved that is then freed, such that the plagues are lifted? How can we translate that into either a psychological or social metaphor?
Well, the first thing that pops into my mind is that we've really had to shift out of a sort of profit first mentality. I mean, this is going to have a huge economic impact. I'm assuming it already is. But people are making these kind of unprecedented decisions to cancel major events like the NBA at the loss of just unimaginable amounts of money for the greater good, which is not the way that we usually operate, at least in this country. So I wonder if it's an introduction of a slightly different paradigm that we're not used to following.
We have been liberated, both liberated, and I think we will suffer from this radical shift, as you mentioned, Lisa, about what we do every day and how to earn money. We will be liberated from it as we stay home or close to home if we possibly can, and we will suffer the loss of the money to pay the rent or to buy food. People will have their children staying at home and being, in effect, homeschooled. And there is a possibility for closeness and connection, and also terrible constraints and suffering of here we all are in close quarters.
So as I take that in, what's mulling around in my mind is that we could say that the existing culture might be enslaved to a kind of materialistic value system, which has had its own rewards for, a long time. And that the freeing up from that might be the freeing up of the global human imagination to pursue some higher values. And that might be demonstrated in the story with this search for the land flowing with milk and honey, the true land. And how might we re-envision the culture after we are freed from these things to have actually a better, more full life?
And I would say, to add to that, that according to the biblical story, took 40 years to find the promised land.
Oh, dear.
And there was a long, hard trek through the desert. It certainly is an interesting possibility, perhaps a promise, that we could find a better way for our society to work and live together.
Well, it offers this opportunity for a reorganization of values.
Right.
Doesn't it?
Absolutely. And coming back to your idea of the 40 years, one possible interpretation of that is that over the course of the 40 years in the wandering, everyone who had lived in slavery would have passed away, so that
Mm-hmm.
only the next generation that was not marred or still mired in the old values would pass into this new paradigm. So again, it may be that the wandering process is required psychologically in order for our own personal values, which have outworn their usefulness, to die away, that we have to become new in our attitudes before we could then construct some kind of new social contract, a new social system.
I love that you use the word wandering. And isn't that the one that's used in the Bible, of wandering in the desert, of being in the don't know, looking for something, not exactly sure where it is? We are wandering now as a global collective. We don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, we don't know what's going to happen next week, even.
But I like that's another kind of archetypal theme that we could fold in here. And I'm thinking about Wotan, and he was the wanderer. That wandering in itself is really huge and mythic and important, that we be able to tolerate the wandering.
And I want to build on that, Deb. I like that you lifted that up and referenced Wotan. And just talk about the psychological concept that Jung spoke about, the relativization of the ego. And what Jung said is that on an individual level, we like to think that our ego is in charge and that we know what's what, and that life is predictable and we can be in control of things and we can make plans and have some confidence that they're going to turn out. When we have a confrontation with what Jung referred to as the self, when we have a confrontation with the unconscious, it completely upends our sense of the world as one in which the ego is in charge and we can be in control. And that is when our ego becomes relativized. That is, we understand just how small the conscious part of our personality is. We understand we can't always be in control. We have to find an ability to tolerate uncertainty and the wandering that you were speaking of, Deb. And that is a very important part of psychological health and individuation. And we might imagine that the virus is enacting this kind of relativization on a collective level. As, kind of world cultures, as societies, we're recognizing that we are not always in charge. We are not always in control of things, that there are these forces that are beyond our ability to control, and they are reminding us of that. And therefore, that brings about this kind of reorientation of values, because we realize we have to be, we realize our dependency on the unconscious, or in this case, we could say our susceptibility to natural forces.
And I'm thinking of the well-known quote from Jung that I won't get exactly right, about whatever gets in the way of ego, for good or evil, that Jung called that God. And this has gotten in the way of our collective ego values, everyday operating system.
I moved to add to what we were just saying, and I want to try to describe what the experience may be when the ego is relativized to the self, because we talk about that it's happened, but I think it's often a bit mysterious about what it looks like after that's occurred. So the ego often starts in its heart-hardened state, much like the Pharaoh in that story, where the ego looks into its own appetites and creates a plan, a drive, a strategy, and begins moving forward, trying to influence events and resources to try to actualize a decision that's been made, and often in a very reasonable kind of worldly dimension. when the ego has been relativized, this capacity to look inward into an imaginal world, which is very real in its internal presentation, gaining access to the images and feelings and autonomous events of the inner world that the waking mind would then interact with and derive new information that the outer environment does not report generally. And to add that into the decision-making process, because it's through the imaginal world, which could also, by the way, involve analyzing your own dreams, through the imaginal world that these higher intelligences that we have access to communicate, sometimes very directly, but often in nuanced ways, what's required in order to move through the world in a way that our fullest self is brought forward. I wonder if you guys have other ideas about what it looks like to have a relativized ego.
Well, I'm really appreciating what you're saying about opening access to the inner world and the imaginal world. And I think the first thing that happens when the ego is relativized is a lot of suffering and pain and grief and loss.
Especially if we've clung really tightly to the fantasy of being in control.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think that relativization comes more easily if we've had a light hold on that. But if that's been a mainstay of how we've moved through the world, that is a real defeat with lots of suffering, Deb. And I think that probably is the situation our society finds itself in now.
Yeah. I would never want to minimize the validity, intensity, reality of that kind of truly legitimate suffering if people are out of work and can't pay the rent. I know there's been a bill passed, but it's going to be cumbersome and it's not going to be easy, I'm sure. And yet, in the midst of all of that and having to sequester ourselves, I also really want to honor, Joseph, your point that there is something to be found, that we do have the opportunity to find something else. It's not as if our ego is the only reality. We know that it isn't. So how do we suffer this? And what kind of new attitude, radical reorientation of ourselves in the world may be possible?
So we're talking about the initial experience of the ego being dethroned and its certainty being shattered and cast out of this kind of tower of isolation, this tower of certainty and goods and services and income and all the trappings of the culture. When the ego is cast out of the certainty of that world, that is a beginning of the process. I don't believe that the ego at that point is relativized to the self. It's in the beginning of an alchemical transformation of being broken down. And quite so that that's often terrorizing or terrifying.
I'm also putting this in the context of nature versus culture. And we have had a lot of culture of the man-made institutions, systems, bureaucracies, all of that. And it's been upended by nature, this greater force, and archetypal reality. The ego has definitely been dethroned.
I want to answer the question that you asked a minute ago, Joseph, is like sort of what can this look like? What are the boons that we get from relativizing the ego? And I want to say that there's something lovely about feeling in control. Mm-hmm. But when we lose that feeling of control and we're in touch with the mystery, then life really comes more alive. There's more of a sense of magic and possibility and mystery, and that is very profound. it can be hard won. I mean, I don't want to make this sound like sparkle and fairy dust here, but being able to live knowing that you're just on the edge of the great mystery, that is a very alive feeling. And it does require being aware that you are not in charge of everything the way you think you are.
And in a very pragmatic way, if we're standing before the great mystery, in whatever way we define it, the shift in the ego is away from speaking to listening. That when the ego feels in charge, it's often in the speaking role of commanding, activating, setting things in motion. When we go into that inner world and we inquire of the things that we don't understand, the listening mode, just in the same way that when you wake up in the middle of the night and you think you've heard somebody open the door downstairs, and all your senses fly open in this waiting to receive information, that mode, when we bring that to the problem, the new things in the life, that invites something to well up from another dimension in the psyche that we might not normally consult.
That is really beautiful. I love that. And I think you're exactly right. I love that, the shift from speaking to listening, and really listening to the unconscious.
One of the things that we will all be listening to, if we're not already, building on your analogy to hearing a door open downstairs or thinking that you do, is we're opening to our own anxiety and fear. And we are forced to listen to that.
I think of the anxiety and the fear as the kind of dwellers on the threshold, that they are almost the guardians that we have to pass through in order to earn entry into the deeper kind of discourse with the wisdom inside of ourselves. So I think of that as an important transitional place in the growing process. But I want to, if it's okay, I want to just toss out some very pragmatic ideas for the listeners, because people are really anxious and they're upset. What are some of the tools that we can offer people in terms of getting access to the wisdom of the unconscious, to the wisdom of something that isn't the clever mind? So just pragmatically, listeners, writing down your dreams as a discipline. Perhaps you're off from work. Perhaps you're not going to set an alarm for a week or two. Waking up to a natural schedule almost always makes it more likely that you're going to remember a dream. So to be able to put that pad of paper by your bedside, and the first thing you do in the morning is write down those dream images, and to believe that this is a symbolic message that is meant to offer some kind of assistance to how you are functioning in this time of crisis.
Yeah, I also, first of all, I think I want to say that I think there's a difference between anxiety and fear. And I think it's an important difference. So I want to lift that up. I like your analogy, Joseph, of those being the sort of watchers at the gate. But I think, anxiety spins us up and keeps us spinning and really doesn't offer us much. Fear comes with a plan of action. And it's something that we can listen to and perhaps take the action or perhaps not. But there's something adaptive about fear. Whereas I think anxiety usually just serves to split us off from emotions. So that's an interesting thing just to watch. But in terms of accessing the wisdom of the unconscious, it might be important to try to differentiate anxiety and fear, because it might be that when you listen to the unconscious, what you hear is fear, and that might be appropriate. I think some fear is appropriate in this situation. I think that journaling can help. I think it's an incredibly powerful tool that can help us sort out maybe what's fear, what's anxiety, what's necessary fear, what's perhaps irrational fear, just in terms of helping us with our feelings. The process of putting something into words, and it's a different thing to put it into words on paper than to speak it, even, although it's powerful to speak it too. But that process, it's like the image in fairy tales where the heroine sometimes has to sort the wheat seeds from the poppy seeds. It's a process of discernment. So if there's a whole bunch in there, if there's a lot of confused emotion, fear, anxiety, panic, sadness, grief, relief, whatever else is there, writing about it can be that process, that slow, careful process of discerning one thing from another.
I would like to add a much more mundane way of coping with this, and that is speaking to friends and family. There are still telephones, and there is virtual technology, FaceTime, or various other things. I have found it really touching that friends have called me and I've called family and friends, that we don't have to be alone in it. We do have a virtual communication capability. And the second thing I think I might add is to do nothing, to sit down, and maybe you journal, maybe you self-reflect, you write down a dream. But it's very tempting to keep moving and buzzing and getting, as you said, Lisa, spun up with the anxiety of to come back home to oneself. Here I am now sitting in this chair. What is it really that I have to get done today for myself, my family, kids, household management, and stay grounded and centered in a kind of one day at a time mentality and an inward journey as well.
So that old salty wisdom of stay calm and carry on and to tend carefully the things that are in front of oneself. But I'm still drawn to this idea of helping people tune into themselves. And I'm just going to offer a little list of things that I think are helpful. One ancient piece of technology is called the 4-count breath. And in mystical traditions, people have done this for a very long time. And you can do this just listening to the tick of a clock, to breathe in on a count of 4, to hold the breath on a count of 4, to exhale on a count of 4, and to hold the breath out on a count of 4. And just that little cycle of breathing, if that's done for 5 minutes, if you're really disciplined to do it for 15 minutes, can create a tremendous regulation of the central nervous system, can both enliven us so that we're concentrating, but also drop down the level of physical anxiety that often is not helpful in the environment, but that also really primes our relationship to the inner world because it requires a dropping down in order to get into that dialogue. Another technique that is extremely helpful is that if you're sitting and you're intending to begin to go deeper, to, in an eye-open state, simply gaze towards any object in the room, to adopt a very soft focus in the eyes, and to begin to open your peripheral vision, seeing the right and left wall simultaneously, and then add seeing the ceiling and the floor simultaneously. And when we sustain a very wide peripheral vision, in about 30 seconds, there's an interesting brainwave shift, and we begin to increase the amount of alpha brainwaves that are developed. And that is what we think of as a light meditation experience, where the imagination becomes extremely accessible. So 4-count breath, peripheral vision, and once we're in that somewhat deeper state, I will often encourage people to bring their awareness to the physical area of the heart. For thousands of years in many different traditions, and for reasons that we don't always understand, that the energy or the imaginal location of the heart seems to be a place where we can beckon imagery from the inner world. So coming into that zone, as if it's a location in the imagination, in the chest, to then ask the deeper part of yourself, in whatever way you imagine it, to gift you with an image that you wouldn't have chosen, an image that could even surprise you or even seem silly or profound, an image to help guide you for that day. And almost always, if we're relaxed enough, an image will come forward. Now, the discipline there is to not edit the image because you don't understand it, but to be able to claim it, at least jot it down, if not sketch it out, and to be able to think about it as some kind of a metaphoric assistance for the day. And often the image will bring a feeling. When I do this in session with clients, an image comes forward and someone might spontaneously giggle, or perhaps they might have a rather sober feeling is brought up. And then as they just circle around this image that came unbidden, there's some way that they can use the image as a way of creating a metaphor for something that needs to be assisted in that day. Two more techniques I want to just put out because I think in times of uncertainty, things to do are just really helpful. Another technique is to do right hand, left hand journaling. To go do your 4-count breath and the peripheral vision and or that, and then just have a piece of paper there, and with your right hand, take your pen, or your dominant hand, take the pen and just write a question that you'd like to ask the unconscious mind, which might be, what am I going to do today with all this free time? Put the pen in the non-dominant hand and bring it to the paper, and then write the first thing that comes into your mind, which will often be, interestingly, surprising. Imagine that there are two personalities, and they control one hand and the other personality controls the other, and begin to create this imaginal dialogue with this other person inside of you, which often is the unconscious. Really fun, interesting, sometimes deeply moving things can come out of that. And a third little technique, which is, by the way, so fun, and you can even do it with your kids, is get a couple of old magazines and just start cutting out pictures from the magazine. There's pictures of dogs and maybe a person in a dress and a sunrise and this and that, and just create a library of images. Put them in a little paper bag when you have a nice big bunch of them, and then each morning just rustle your hand around in the bag and just pick 3 images out of the bag and make a story out of the images. And your unconscious mind will grab those 3 images and weave them into a waking dream that often has a metaphoric meaning for you. So there are many other ways to access the unconscious, but all of those things are ways to relativize the ego to the self, because we're listening to something other than the ego level interpretation of what's happening.
That's really lovely, Joseph. Thank you for all of those. And I think that it's what we're really talking about is listening to some other part of ourselves. And we're saying that the coronavirus crisis that the entire world is in is an opportunity for us to do that both as a global collective and also individually.
I really like that you also lifted up something, my favorite F word, Joseph, which is fun, that we still have ourselves. And the chief tenet of Jungian psychology is that we are so much more than most of us ever have time or an opportunity to experience. And this dialogue between self and self can be a bit of an adventure. It can be fun. It can be a discovery that there is in this place of scarcity and all the rest. There is also opportunity. There is more to us than we've usually had a chance to experience.
There's something related to this that's been coming up a couple of times in my sessions this past week, which I've had a couple of people say, I feel guilty talking about this stuff when there's so much else going on in the world. I feel guilty talking about, my sadness that my trip got canceled, or my, fears that my event is not going to go forward, or my concerns about my relationship, or my feelings of sadness about being lonely, or whatever it is. I feel like how can this matter when the world is in such crisis? And there's a way that I really want to push back on that, because it is in the daily events of an individual life that things proceed. And I want to bring in this quote from Jung about that, if I may. He says, the great events of world history are, at bottom, profoundly unimportant. In the last analysis, the essential thing is the life of the individual. This alone makes history. Here alone do the great transformations first take place. And the whole future, the whole history of the world, ultimately spring as a gigantic summation from these hidden sources in individuals. In our most private and most subjective lives, we are not only the passive witnesses of our age and its sufferers, but also its makers. We make our own epoch.
Wow.
So, in the midst of this, don't abandon your own life. Cling to it and foster it and worry it and suffer it.
And deepen it.
And deepen it.
That's really an incredible quote, and incredibly affirming and validating of a lot of what we've been trying to say, that the life of the individual, and you have that, you can have that. You still have a lot of say-so over that. It's very affirming of inner life and its availability.
And I'm wondering if it would be a good time. We found a fairy tale about the plague that we thought was really interesting. Does this feel like a good time to go to that?
Sure.
Absolutely.
So this is a Slavic fairy tale from Polish language. The Plague and the Peasant. A peasant sat down in the shade of a larch tree to rest. The sun was high and glowing. Suddenly he perceived something approaching him from a distance. As it came nearer, he saw that it was a woman wrapped in a large cloak. Her legs were of a wonderful length. The peasant was greatly frightened and tried hard to run away, but the spectre seized him with her bony arms and said, "Do you know the plague? It is I. Take me on your shoulders and carry me over the whole country. You must not miss a town, a village, or even a hamlet. I must be carried everywhere. For yourself be not afraid. In the midst of death and misery, you shall remain alive and well." She put her long arms round his neck. The peasant started, but surprised at feeling no weight, he turned his head, and then saw the spectre was sitting on his shoulders. He took her first to a town. There was music and dancing in the taverns, and joy in every place. Mirth and pleasure held their sway. When the peasant entered into the marketplace, the woman shook her pestilential garments. Soon the music and dancing ceased, joy disappeared, and terror reigned supreme. The terrified peasant saw coffins and dead bodies on every side. He heard the funeral bells everywhere. Soon the cemetery was filled, and there was no more room to bury the dead. Even in the marketplace, many a corpse was left without a grave. On went the miserable peasant. Whenever he passed through a village, the houses were left empty. The inhabitants, pale and trembling, fled. Men were dying on the roads, in the woods, and in the fields. His native village stood on a high hill. There lived his wife, his little children, and his aged parents. At the sight of it, his heart bled within him. Seizing the spectre with all his strength, lest she should escape, he hurried past his home. Before him flowed the river Pruth with its blue waters. On the other side arose green hills, and far beyond dark mountains capped with snow, lost their summits in the clouds. His resolution was quickly taken. He rushed on and plunged headlong into the river, hoping by meeting death himself to drown the plague also, and thus to save the country from further desolation. The unhappy peasant perished in the waters, but the plague, as a spirit, could not be drowned. Overcome, however, by his courageous act, she fled away in terror and hid herself among the mountains. Thus the peasant not only saved his village and all those who were dear to him, but also that part of his native land into which the plague had not been carried.
There's really such evocative imagery, isn't it? The way that, we can literally be carriers of this disease. I mean, that's why, now they're saying with the coronavirus that even if you're non-symptomatic, you can be a carrier, just the way this peasant was an asymptomatic carrier. And that is the reason why we should all be staying home, because by choosing not to go somewhere, we may be sparing others. So in a way, this fairy tale really has this and is an image of this social distancing, isn't it? When he decides not to go into his home village,
but to try to drown it in the river.
Mm-hmm.
I think just extending what you're saying, Lisa, which is it's such a theme of caring, that at the beginning, when he wasn't related to people in villages, he carried the pestilence through those villages. But when he got to his own home, where he cared about people, that motivated him to even try to sacrifice himself. And that the social distancing is caring for people that we don't know, people in the supermarket or our neighborhood or our fellow workers, anyone. That our caring can't just be restricted to our immediate family and friends. It has to be, and I think it is becoming really quite global as I see pictures of city streets that are empty and people wanting to protect others as well as themselves.
Yeah, it's heartening. On Twitter, there's a hashtag flatten the curve. Do your part, stay home. And it's a kind of a collective action that needs to be taken that some people are taking quite seriously. And it's heartening to see that sort of the spirit of collective responsibility for one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there is no us and them. It's we.
As well as the collective social advice that this fairy tale is probably capturing in a very real way and then being passed forward through the telling of the fairy tale to other generations. I'd also like to take the fairy tale as a dream as well. And so if we imagine that the peasant would represent the dream ego, and that somewhere in the unconscious, a woman wrapped in a large cloak with abnormally long and wonderful legs begins to come towards him, and he's frightened. He wants to run away, but she seizes him and makes a demand. Then he carries the quantity of this to other people. So I would like to say that there's another dimension of what we're seeing as all this is playing out, that people are being met by their deep fears and anxieties, And those fears and anxieties are saying, you must carry me on your shoulders and you must spread me to every village and every town and every person that you possibly know and fill them with feelings of foreboding to destroy all mirth and happiness and in its stead to replace this mood of death and despair. And that's another cautionary tale that while we want to know the facts about any kind of misfortune, and that's natural to us as sapiens, by the way, we want to know where danger is, but resilience involves responding to danger with wisdom. And wisdom does not destroy life and happiness and the human soul. As a matter of fact, wisdom allows us to thrive. But here, because the man is holding on to this feeling of horror, it spreads in all these places. It's when he comes to his own family that he remembers, as parents often do, there are things and moods that you don't want to infect your children with. I'm sure this is happening all over the world as parents are understandably frightened listening to the news. They also want to protect their children from being terrified. And so it's in that moment where I think there's also great wisdom that he grabs on to the specter of horror and clings it to himself and refuses to infect his family with these feelings of horror and has to find a way to try to douse, to cool off, to bring this feeling of fear and return it to the unconscious so it doesn't create panic. Because panic is the enemy of wisdom.
Yeah, so you're talking about the way that information and feelings can also be contagious. And of course, good information can be contagious and bad information can be contagious, and positive emotions are contagious and negative emotions are contagious. And so I think that is a kind of corollary to what's happening. And it is also very much in this fairy tale. I want to lift up that I love the image of pestilence as a spirit. And whether we're actually talking about a kind of metaphoric understanding of the disease, or we're thinking about what you're lifting up, Joseph, that, information or feelings, that there is a spirit is a transcendent force. And there is a way that the disease and the fear that it's spreading both represent archetypal transcendent forces that we are coming in contact with. So that seems to me very fitting.
From a social science point of view, it's also called availability bias. And that is the more vivid, the more frequent, the more common and serious information itself is, the more we tend to take it on and take it in, rather than being able to return it, as you say in the tale, Joseph, to the unconscious. It may be wise not to keep listening to newscast after newscast after newscast, because that in itself tends to further feelings of fear and anxiety and stress and kind of preclude our access to wisdom.
Along those lines, I wanted to just look at the word plague, which comes from the Latin plangere, which means to strike the breast as if in lamentation. And we can hear in the collective this lamentation around this fate that has come to the earth, the global community, the lamentation of those who have passed. But to carry the spirit of lamentation on one's shoulders and to spread it in all places, I do not believe that that's a service to the resilience of the human spirit, although we do need all the facts that we need to stay safe. And it is in the end of the fairy tale that is, however, by this courageous act, the spirit, the specter of the plague, fled away in terror. the feeling of terror being translated back into the archetype, and that the antidote for some of the carrying of the lamentation is a sense of human courage. And even now, the human courage that we will muster through this, that we will deal with whatever accommodations are necessary. We will deal with having to be out of work for a week or two, but that we have the courage to rally and to move forward.
Yes, and courage certainly will be necessary. And I wonder with that if it's a good time to switch to a dream.
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, this is Lisa from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing the podcast involves substantial expenses, and we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month, and at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
Today's dreamer is a man. He's 34 years old, and he works as a child and family therapist. And here is the dream. The landscape is a lush, deep forest. In the foreground is what appears to be a bush, a brightly colored bush that looks like something out of science fiction, as it is unique to the shrubbery around it. In fact, the neon-colored blossoms on the shrub are the club-shaped viral spike peplomers of a virus, and I immediately know this, quote, bush to be an image of a coronavirus. A female deer is peacefully munching on these, quote, blossoms one by one. I take the image of the deer eating the blossoms of the virus bush to represent how the wonders of the natural world can be an antidote to the pandemics of our time. And for the context of the dream, he says his main feelings were peace and hope.
So I have a couple of initial thoughts, but I wish the dreamer was here to do a bit of work. Is that the deer has often been seen as a symbol for the soul. It shows up in, I think it's in Psalms, like as the hart desireth the water brook, so longeth my soul after thee. The hart was an old-fashioned word for deer, H-A-R-T. So often there is a feeling about it. So it may very well be that the image of the coronavirus requires a spiritual solution, that really only the soul or some kind of spiritual help has the vitality, has the resilience to eat up these images safely and in a way give the ego some breathing space from the flooding of images and media which don't necessarily help us stay calm and resilient.
Yeah, it's such an image of an antidote, really, isn't it? An antidote to fear.
And it's a female deer. It's not a stag. And females, of course, as we know, are generative. I'm also appreciating, underscoring everything you said, Joseph, that this takes place in a lush, deep forest, which, as we know from many a fairy tale, is often a symbol of the unconscious, the wilderness, the wilderness.
And the dream itself is sort of an example of that, right? I mean, here is the unconscious bringing up a numinous image that brings peace and hope in a time of great fear and crisis. This is the generativity of the unconscious.
Yeah. With this gentle symbol of a female deer, there hasn't been a dragon kind of breathing fire and attacking right and left. It is a very peaceful image of a gentle animal peacefully munching these coronavirus blossoms. The quiet, gentle, integrative kind of mood that is evoked by the image of the animal.
We've been talking about plagues as kind of a divine intervention or punishment, and as kind of a herald of an encounter with self that requires a reorganization. As I was reading this dream the first time, it was not lost on me that this is a kind of burning bush.
Oh, that's really wonderful, Lisa.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's exactly right. And he says that it's a brightly colored bush, and it stands out with its neon colored blossoms from all of the other plant life around it.
The reason they call it a coronavirus is that the microscopic pictures of it show it as a circle with these kind of red flame-like sparks coming out of it, like the corona of the sun.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, so it is a kind of encounter with the dark side of God, as it were, this virus. And here's the antidote.
Yes, exactly. Here is the antidote. That psyche, this dreamer's psyche, but I think it's psyche writ large for all of us through the dream of this individual.
This really does feel like a collective, a dream for the collective, doesn't it?
It really feels like a gift to us of that the antidote is natural life peacefully integrating or assimilating this virus. And what we've been saying earlier in this podcast of turning within, turning to one's own psyche and one's own generativity as a way of assimilating and integrating even this coronavirus.
And one of the interesting things about deer, if any of you live in the country and have had a garden, deer can eat anything. They will, like, I bought Nandina. They're supposed to hate Nandina. They will eat anything, even stuff they're not supposed to eat. And
they can digest it, right? Yeah, they can metabolize
they're these digesting machines in all of that kind of placid way. So, yes, it's kind of a pretty poetic image, but there's also something very earthy about their capacity, much like goats. To chomp it down and walk away smiling. So it certainly is a sign of tremendous resilience. Just using trauma theory a little bit, is that, when we're constantly being stirred into distress about the news or the exaggeration of the news or the fact that these things, as Deb said, are being repeated 800 times a day and people are staring and listening to it, is that the amygdala becomes incredibly activated in the brain. And the amygdala is part of this warning system for sapiens. We need it, but also we can flood the amygdala and it will hold onto horrifying images long past their usefulness. So the deer also, to me, represents the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is that slow, methodical, thoughtful chewing over of what's real, what's truly in the environment, what's actually going on in my body, what's happening right in front of me, versus the imagery that we've been colonized by in the media. So again, we have to separate out the facts which we respond to wisely versus the thousands of repetitions of information, along with music and color and sound, by the way, which is part of making it interesting in a media environment, which confuse that ancient amygdala part of our brain. So just find the facts, make wise decisions, and then wait another day to just see if there's a handful of facts, and then to shut down the stream of overwhelm so that we're not drinking from a fire hose that really doesn't give us anything that we need to know every 5 minutes. So on that note, I'm going to go and do some 4-count breaths for a little while.
And I'm going to go have lunch.
Oh, very nice.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.